back to the Washington Outsider Report on the Coalition Radio. For those newly joining the program, my name is Riehle, and I am the editor-in-chief of the Washington Outsider. Today, in light of the very complicated events going on in the US, in Europe, all over the world, involving Russian intelligence and its various proxies and partners, we have an interesting topic focused on the evolving role of Russian intelligence from its historic roots to its current days, and how it manages to play an increasingly sophisticated, complicated alliance-based role in complicated active measures operations that we are witnessing today, and that are not always easily attributable to Russia directly. With us today to discuss the subject is Kevin Riehle. He's the author of Russian Intelligence, a case-based study of Russian services and missions past and present, which gives us a bit of an insider understanding of how various Russian intelligence directorates programs work. He is based with the Center for Intelligence and Security Studies. He's an instructional associate professor for that center at the University of Mississippi. He spent over 30 years in the U.S. government as a counterintelligence analyst, and we'll get to what exactly that means, studying foreign intelligence services, finishing his government career at the National Intelligence University, and he's got a PhD in war studies from King's College in London, and has an extensive background in Soviet and Eastern Bloc history and Russian intelligence history, and publishes on these topics widely to various specialist journals. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for the invitation.
Before we delve into this very interesting topic, could you tell us a little about, first of all, how you decided to get involved in intelligence? Why Soviet and Eastern specifically? What made you continue with that specialty even after it became less popular given the counterterrorism climate and basically the shift after the end of the Cold War? And what exactly is a counterintelligence analyst? I understand it may seem self-explanatory, but for many people, their views of intelligence are basically based on James Bond movies, and they may not have a very good understanding.
I got into this after my undergraduate degree, which I completed in the late 1980s, and my undergraduate degree was a combination of Russian language and political science, and that's what brought me into the former Soviet field, and I stayed with that on and off for much of my career, although, as you pointed out, during a period of time in the U.S. intelligence community, the emphasis on Russia was not as great. So being a Russian linguist was not always the highest priority, but that's what got me into it in the first place, was having a degree in Russian language. Professionally, I moved in and out of the Russian area. I worked a number of different regions of the world over my 30 years. But the concept of a counterintelligence analyst is basically looking at how a foreign intelligence service operates, what are their strengths and weaknesses, and then how can we exploit those weaknesses and avoid those strengths. And so that's what I did in supporting the various U.S. government agencies over my 30-year career. And I ended with about 4 years at the National Intelligence University, where I was teaching mid-career students about those topics, about the former Soviet space and how it operates, what are the politics of that former Soviet space. And then I retired from that and came to the University of Mississippi, and that's how I got where I am.
So I'm going to start with a little bit of a provocative question. By now, most people agree that the military capabilities of Russia have been overestimated based on their current field performance in Ukraine. Would you say the same is true or completely off base in terms of their intelligence operations? Have they also been overestimated, or are they about as good as people imagine them to be?
Russian intelligence activities have a mixed record. In some ways, they are one of the premier capabilities in the world. That includes both their human activities as well as their technical activities. Technical activities, including SIGINT and computer-based activities, are some of the best that there are. However, they're also not without weaknesses. Some of those weaknesses are of their own making. And sometimes Russia's own actions seem to shoot Russia's own foot, shoot itself in the foot by doing things that get Russia itself into trouble. Sometimes, for example, there have been a number of Russian intelligence activities that have been revealed over the past, particularly few years, and even more intensely over the past year and a half. Russia's clandestine and covert activities are not universally successful. In fact, there have been many Russian intelligence covert operations that have been revealed publicly, including hacking incidents, recruitments of spies in various countries, manipulating foreign political environments. And all of those things compound on each other when they are caught and when they're revealed. When that sort of an activity is made public, then it makes it more difficult to continue with that sort of activity in the future, because counterintelligence services are more aware, they are more alert, and they are more willing to work together. A number of the activities that the things that we've seen happen against Russian intelligence operations in the past, particularly year, are cooperative in nature. And that cooperation, to a certain extent, comes because of that compounding effect that Russian activities have been revealed, and thus countries are more willing to work together. So just for example, since the beginning of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, over 600 Russian personnel have been expelled from diplomatic establishments, mostly in Europe. Many of those personnel are intelligence officers. And when those intelligence officers are expelled, that just makes it harder to do their job. If 400 to 500 officers are removed, that means that they don't have the accesses that they used to have, particularly in an area where Russia is a particular high priority area for Russia right now. Europe, North America, where most of those expulsions have occurred. In addition to those legal representatives, at least 7 and possibly 9 Russian intelligence illegals have also been exposed since mid-2022. Illegals are the operatives that can continue to operate when the legal or diplomatically covered officers are removed. The illegals are the officers that have no connection, no visible connection to the Russian government. So theoretically, they should be able to operate even if the diplomatically covered positions are either under too much scrutiny or simply removed. But if 7 to 9 illegals are also removed, that means that fallback is gone as well. Several of those illegals and almost all of those legal expulsions have occurred because of cooperative operations and the sharing of information across international borders. So as Russia gets caught, it'll get caught more because of that compounding effect.
Given that this is a significant challenge for the Russian intelligence service, and I'll get back to some of the other questions I have in a moment, would you say that they're more likely to shift to other operational methods, such as relying more on foreign nationals who are less likely to get scrutinized in court, or develop other evolve the role of the illegals from the model that was working in the 1980s, but which is obviously getting compromised now?
Russia is not going to stop by any means. They're going to continue to try. And even with that illegals model, typically illegals during the Cold War and even into the post-Cold War era were individuals who portrayed a non-Russian identity, an identity that completely disconnected them from Russia, ethnically, linguistically, and with no communications, no overt communications to Russia. That was the normal model. And that continues to be a model that both the SVR and the now more recently the GRU are using. However, in the 2000s, mid-2000, 2005-ish timeframe, Russia experimented with a new model. And that new model was to send young Russians abroad using Russian identities, not hiding their Russianness, but not maintaining connections, overt connections back to Russia, emigrating abroad. People like Anna Chapman, who was now quite famous, real name Anna Kushenka, Mikhail Semenka, were Russians who emigrated abroad. Anna Chapman was working as a real estate agent. Mikhail Semenka was a graduate student. Another individual, Karetnikov, was working at I believe it was Microsoft Corporation in Washington State. They weren't trying to hide their Russianness. But in 2010, when the United States arrested 10 illegals and issued an arrest warrant for an 11th and expelled a 12th, that new model appears to have not been as successful. The Russians were kicked out, basically, and they were then traded for others who came to the West in their stead. Since then, it doesn't appear that there have been many attempts to use that experimental model. But Russia does have access still to non-Russians, such as the many non-Russian foreign workers who work in Russia from Central Asia or from the Caucasus, from Moldova, who could portray themselves as non-Russians naturally and could be less open to that scrutiny that now Russians experience around the world. That experiment with using Russian nationals, not hiding their Russianness, is probably less likely to succeed today than it did in the mid-2000s, because at that point, Russians could travel around the world without any scrutiny. There were not suspicion on Russians. Now, Russians traveling around the world are paid a lot more attention to, so that model may not work as well. But using other non-Russians may be something they would turn toward.
Now, I'll get back to this issue momentarily, but I wanted to go back in time and to get a little bit more of an understanding of how we ended up in the place we are today, because in your book, you describe very accurately that to some extent, Russian intelligence has traditionally relied on its historic roots in the Tsarist Okhrana, in a very outdated, power-based role of the security services that evolved into the Soviet form of intelligence that we are all familiar with, and that has since gradually moved its way into the contemporary groups such as FSB, SVR, and the military intelligence GRU, the way they're being currently portrayed. Now, why is it that that model, first of all, was successful, but then even when it was challenged, continued to be integrated into the training of these intelligence officers? Why was it never upgraded or basically developed into a different direction?
Well, I think over the roots in the pre-Bolshevik Russia are certainly there, and I'll talk a little more about that in a minute. But there was a lot of modification from that. That was a foundation.
Mm-hmm.
That was a foundation, particularly of monitoring the Russian population,
Mm-hmm.
which the Okhrana did extensively. That was a model for operating offensively abroad. And that the people who established the first Bolshevik era Soviet State Security Service, the Cheka, were those who had operated against that Tsarist era model. They actually knew it because they were the people being pursued by it. And so when they established a Bolshevik era or a new Soviet era State Security Service, they had that as a foundation. When over time it did evolve, it did become more capable than the Okhrana ever was. During the Cold War, particularly internal monitoring within the Soviet Union became very sophisticated. And the foreign intelligence was also, in many ways, very successful. But it still used some of those Tsarist era methods because they're easy to use, first of all, and they work. And frankly, Russia's not the only intelligence service that uses those. Many services around the world use similar sorts of methods of double agentry and provocations and establishing basically attractive targets for someone for an adversary to come to so that you can monitor their activities. Those are all things the Okhrana did. And the Soviets continue with that, but other countries do that too. So those are basically tried intelligence methods that work. Many people today say Russian intelligence services, particularly FSB, is a copy of the Soviet services. And to some extent, that's true. There's much that has been inherited from the Soviet era. But there are really three different time frames that affect the FSB and the other Russian intelligence services today, the SVR, GRU, and then the FSO, the Federal Protective Service, which also inherits its existence from the KGB. The first is that Soviet era, and much of the structure comes from that. But before that, what is the Tsarist era? During the Soviet era, it was taboo to talk publicly about the Tsarist era. You are not allowed to say that we inherited anything from the Tsarist era. That was what the Bolsheviks had fought against. So you couldn't publicly acknowledge that we had anything, that we had any methods that the Tsarists used. They were the evil, the bourgeois evil. But they had them. They just didn't talk about it. Then the Soviet era came along and they used similar methods. They perfected them. They evolved them over time. But then the Soviet Union dissolved as well. And with the dissolution of the Soviet Union came a number of forces that have also shaped the current Russian intelligence and state security services. The stripping away of a communist ideology is a major change from the Soviet era. And the Russian intelligence services today don't have a communist ideology. And to a certain extent, that has freed them from the restrictions that the communist ideology had. the communist ideology made certain things taboo, such as talking about the Tsarist era. And today, Russian intelligence services openly discuss their inheritance from the Tsarist era. They don't hide it. They write scholarly articles about it. The FSB's unclassified journal called FSB Zai Protiv, FSB For and Against, frequently carries articles that connect the Tsarist era to Russia today. That's something that is very different from what have looked at what the Soviet era KGB or GRU would have looked like. And another thing that is very different is the experience that officers in today's Russian intelligence and state security services had during the 1990s, when Russia experienced deterioration, political, military, economic, and the Russian officers today remember that. They remember the embarrassment that Russia experienced during that period. And Putin himself has said, we will never allow ourselves to be weak again. The weakness of the 1990s is a major driver for Russian services today. So all three of those periods, the Tsarist era, which now is remembered with heroism and fondness, the Soviet era, which contributes much of the structure to the intelligence services today, and then the post-Soviet 90s, all give Russian intelligence state security services their personality today.
To some extent, Putin's Russia is even more reflective of the Tsarist era, not only in terms of this fond intelligence roots, but also geopolitical accumulation of power and quest for power. And we can see Russia's resurgent interest in the Middle East and its relationship, a very complex relationship with Turkey as part of that scheme that I think people don't quite understand fully. I think there is a natural comparison to the Soviet era, where the Soviet Union too was engaged in various international campaigns around the world. But in terms of geopolitical structure, I think the language from Putin's close circles is more connected and linked to the areas of the stars of the imaginary mythological past greatness.
Putin and many around him, not just Putin himself, but those who surround him, are very quick to connect what they're doing today with the greatness of the Russian Empire. Alexander the First, to Peter the Great, to connect what Putin is doing today to them gives them a sense of empire, a sense of a grandness that was particularly missing during the 1990s. That embarrassment, that weakness of the 1990s is a driver for bringing that greatness back, so that Russia can then say, look, we are a world player. I have written, and I would posit that there are 5 major Russian security goals, and some of them are connected back to that era. One of those, protecting the Putin regime. That was an Akhrana responsibility, protecting the Tsarist regime. Russia has today a system in place to protect the Putin regime. Another is controlling the post-Soviet space. That is reconnecting Russia to much of the space that was part of the Russian Empire, that was under the Russian Empire in the pre-Bolshevik era. One that is newer than that, a security goal, is counterweighing the unipolar actor in the world. When Russia uses the phrase unipolar actor, it's talking about the United States, and countering the unipolar actor is a security goal that probably doesn't connect as much back to the Tsarist era, but is more connected to the Soviet era. Another goal is portraying Russia as an indispensable player in world affairs. That is directly connected back to Russia being one of the major powers during the imperial time, during Russia's imperial era. And the fifth main Russian security goal is dividing and disrupting NATO and the European Union. That also derives mostly back from the Cold War, but also can be seen when Russia involved itself in World War I to try to counterweigh then the Imperial German activities and to join with other European players to do that. So those five major security goals have reflections back to, at least some of them have reflections back to that Tsarist era.
You mentioned a very important point, which is that getting rid of the communist ideology liberated the security services, the intelligence services. But on the other hand, some criticize the non-ideological nature of these services for allowing them to put aside the national goals of the country to align themselves with organized crime and various other such groups, and essentially to become corrupted and self-interested and almost divergent from any state and national goals of the country itself. How would you comment on this relationship and where Russia is today and where the security services, intelligence services are vis-a-vis these political moves by the country?
You're absolutely correct that removing that ideological driver, that freedom that came from that, also led individual officers to think more of their own interests and rather than the interests of the greater good. And that led to them looking for opportunities to enrich themselves, using their official positions and using investigations into banks, using their ability to move goods clandestinely around the country to smuggle goods into the country. That has been that freedom that came from removing the ideological driver did lead Russian officers to think for themselves and thus to be much more connected to corruption. The KGB during the Soviet era, actually, for all of the brutality that that characterized it, was actually known for being rather uncorrupted. I mean, it wasn't a kind organization by any means, but it wasn't necessarily connected to the corruption that the communist system encouraged. Now, there were individual cases, obviously. There were individual officers who were corrupted, but it was not nearly to the extent that it has grown to become in the post-Soviet era. And that removal of a unifying driver is a big reason for that. I mean, there have been a number of high-profile cases involving FSB officers in conducting a variety of crimes to the point of using their knowledge of banking investigations to basically rob a criminal who was about to deposit money into a bank in Russia. They knew from their investigative accesses that this corrupt businessman was about to deposit a large amount of money. So they basically showed up at the bank and robbed him before he could deposit the money. The officers were arrested for that, but among the officers that were involved in that were some of the highest priority, or the elite from the Alpha and Wimpel special operations units of the FSB. They're the officers who are supposed to be the most loyal, the best trained, and several of them were involved in that robbery operation. So those types of incidents are extremely embarrassing. but they have become an expectation for the FSB in particular, which has been much more victim of that than other former other state security services, that to become almost commonplace.
Now, anyone who is corruptible is also recruitable. Why haven't the Western intelligence services done even more to penetrate these clusters of organized crime intelligence groupings and to essentially disrupt them, wreak havoc, collect intelligence, weaken Russia from within? We are seeing people repeatedly, our media especially, but also even official spokespeople, seemingly surprised by the various actions of the Russians, whereas all of this is essentially open book, and furthermore, based on what you're telling me, they know where they used to be ideologically.
I'm not sure they haven't had success.
Mm-hmm.
For example, the FBI now openly has announced that from 2000 until 2010 was investigating a group of illegal intelligence operatives in the United States. The FBI called it the Ghost Stories Operation. There's a very good book about this called Russians Among Us by BBC journalist Gordon Carrera. I highly recommend that book. But the FBI was watching that operation for a decade, and they then arrested them when it came to the point where they needed to close that operation down. Just in the past week, the FBI, in conjunction with other Five Eyes intelligence alliance partners, US, UK, Australia, Canada, New Zealand, announced that it had disabled an FSB computer intrusion system called Snake that it had been monitoring for years. And it had seen this computer intrusion operation working for a number of years, penetrating into some countries' systems and preventing it from penetrating into others when it was getting too close to information of value, and then shutting it down when it came to the point where it was time to do that. There are certainly Russian intelligence operations that have been successful. I'm not trying to say everything Russia does is unsuccessful. I mean, there was an individual arrested in the United States in 2020 named Peter Debbins, who had been recruited in the 1990s. So he had been operating for Russia for a number of years. There was an individual arrested in Germany in 2022 who was an employee of the Russian intelligence service, the BND, who had been operating for a number of years. So it's not like Russia is completely incapable. But I think, as I mentioned earlier, that cooperative effort that has emerged from Russia's own actions being caught so often is going to make it more difficult, is going to put even more scrutiny, and is going to mean that particularly Western counterintelligence services are going to have more success against them in the future. Now, there are Russian operations that foreign counterintelligence services don't know about. There's undoubtedly, they exist. Russia is not a completely incompetent organization by any means. But there are some that we now know have actually been monitored for a while. So that Russia probably didn't realize that it was being monitored. And so they continue to operate. So it's a mix, I think.
Now, it's interesting to note that corruption works both ways. To the same extent that the corruption within these intelligence services is opening them to vulnerabilities, opening them to foreign penetration and law enforcement successes. At the same time, they can use the same thing against us and use corruption to recruit agents of influence quite easily without many of these people even fully understanding who they are really working for and what's benefiting them, and political polarization, ignorance of history, simple greed and attention seeking from various people. All of these issues are of benefit to the FSB. Now, in recent years, we have seen a lot of we maybe see less formal spies that are recruited to sit there and steal military secrets, and more of these political agents of influence quite in the open, spouting propaganda, pushing political influence campaigns, lobbying, or simply pushing Russia's talking points politically. What new methods do you think need to be utilized to kind of change this dynamic? Because clearly, with the wider and more open communication systems and more openness and more access, these types of things are much easier to dispense than previously, when you had to recruit individual, spies in the government, and all of that took a lot of work and resources.
Those old methods are not gone by any means.
No, but they've been complemented by these techniques, for sure.
And those techniques that many consider new are really not new.
Mm-hmm.
The concept of manipulating political environments is not new at all. In fact, that goes back to a 1920s era in the early Bolshevik era, when the Soviet government quite openly manipulated foreign governments, particularly in Europe, but also in Asia, and did so with the specific goal of spurring Bolshevik-style revolutions. At that point, the Russian military intelligence service, then called the Razvedupr, or the Razvedovательное управление, the intelligence directorate, was a major player in that. That responsibility for manipulation moved from the military intelligence realm to the civilian state security service, the NKVD, then the MGB, and then the KGB eventually. And the military service actually got out of that business for a period of time. They were more involved with technology collection, with penetrating foreign military services, while preparing for wartime covert operations if a war were to kick off. Another of the results of the stripping away of the communist era ideology was that the military intelligence service has gotten more involved back in those manipulation operations than it had been during the Soviet era. The concept of active measures, which is actually a phrase Russians don't use any longer, that you'll never see that phrase in Russian literature today. That is a KGB era phrase. That was a KGB clandestine operational method. And the GRU wasn't really involved in that much. Since the Soviet era dissolved, since the Soviet Union dissolved, the GRU, or the GU as it's officially called, the R was actually removed from the acronym about 15 years ago, although it's still usually called the GRU, has gotten back into the covert action realm. And we see that in things like covert assassinations and covert manipulations in places like Montenegro and North Macedonia, in sabotage operations in places like Czechia, and an attempted assassination in the UK. Those GRU operations have become more common in the last 15 or so years than they had been earlier in the post-Soviet era, or during the Soviet era. So the GRU is back in that game again, and that includes that political manipulation. While at the same time, the FSB is involved in that political manipulation, particularly in the post-Soviet space, in Ukraine, in Moldova, in Armenia, in Georgia, in Kyrgyzstan, and to also a certain extent in the Baltic states. the world is divided in the Russian intelligence and state security mind into the former Soviet space and further abroad, the near abroad, or the Ближнее Зарубежье, and the further abroad. And the FSB has the primary responsibility in that near abroad space. So when we see operations to manipulate, for example, the government of Ukraine over the past 20 years or so, the various switches back and forth between a pro-Russian and a more Western-leaning government, the FSB has been directly involved in those and influencing that. In Moldova, the FSB is heavily involved. But if you go further abroad into places like the ones I mentioned earlier, Montenegro or North Macedonia or Czechia, those are much more GRU operations today. The GRU also appears to have gotten back into the business of illegal intelligence operatives. I've done some research into the history of illegals, and I've actually not seen any GRU illegals, long-term illegals, after the 1950s. The KGB ran illegals throughout the period from the 50s through the end of the Soviet era and into the post-Soviet era. But GRU illegals are something that we've seen more in the past 10 years than was since the 1950s. So that return of the GRU into the covert action realm includes the covert placement of individuals abroad. And so, and in some cases, the GRU is not as good as the SVR or the FSB. They've made mistakes. They've gotten themselves caught. If we watch some investigative journalist coverage of, for example, the GRU actions to attempt to assassinate Sergei Skripal in the UK in 2018, their tradecraft wasn't that good. They got caught on street cameras, and they used travel plans that were not that hard to unravel. So they got caught. And the same has occurred in other places like Czechia and in Montenegro. So that covert action realm, whether it be in the information space, inserting information into the information space for manipulation purposes, or in the physical space, sabotaging a weapons depot in Czechia in 2014, are things that the GRU has gotten itself more involved in, but not always successfully. Now, you mentioned the increase in the information dissemination capabilities. That has made information operations quicker and cheaper, but in the tactics that they use, they actually look a lot like KGB era active measures operations. The actual insertion of information into the information space, and then the amplifying it through Moscow-centric media sources, media origination systems, is very similar to the Soviet era. So while those operations are cheaper and faster, they actually look a lot like they did during the Soviet era.
You remind me of Czechia's, there was some demonstrations, anti-war demonstrations I think sometime last year, essentially, which were widely reported by quote-unquote alternative media in the United States as something reflective of a general popular dissent from the official rhetoric, etc., projecting a lot of internal US-based concerns on other countries in Europe, and obviously to the benefit of the Russian security services. So my question is, when you have this type of dynamic, when you have a very obvious penetration of particular communities in European countries, which cannot be easily compared, by the way, to the United States in many ways, because we don't have the same dynamics, same concerns, and same communities. And people here take advantage of that, and you end up having these massive almost natural information campaigns. And I think Russia even really needs to do anything when you have people who just don't understand what's really going on, picking up on it and thinking that being very independent minded by latching on to this kind of optics. What are the best tools to counter this sort of disinformation effort and this sort of very, very primitive, really, actions that nevertheless, are feeding into the current zeitgeist?
If there's one thing Russia is very good at, this is during the Soviet era and since the Soviet era, it is identifying and exploiting existing weaknesses and divisions. Russia really is not capable of creating divisions, but it can recognize them and play to them. And much of that dynamic that you're talking about in Czechia or in other places, like even in the Netherlands or other countries in France, identifying that fissure in society and then infiltrating the loudest voices to widen that fissure if possible. That has occurred in the United States as well. And there are those kind of fringe voices that are very quick to recognize and amplify the divisive content. Really, the only thing that can be done in a democratic society is to be less divisive. A strong, unified democratic state, a state where divisions do not devolve into anger, but can be discussed in a level-headed and equal way, are not as susceptible to that catalyst to division. A strong society can withstand those Russian infiltration efforts. A weaker democratic society is a society where the discourse is easily inflamed, can't survive it as well. And so we see some countries that are more susceptible to those infiltrations of loud and divisive voices because they're not their democratic discourse is not as strong. Any country where democratic discourse is acceptable, where differences of opinion are allowed, where a diversity of voices are accepted as normal, is less likely to be victim to those infiltrations. That's how we counter it, is by healing the divisions in our society. Now, that sounds easy. It's not. It's a big problem. But that's the more anger that is in our society, the easier it is to throw flame on that fire.
And some of that anger is, by the way, directed at our own intelligence services, which is part of the problem. The problem is both the fact that they lost our trust and the fact that we sometimes have a tendency to rely more on foreign voices than our own. But here's another issue that's directly related to that, and that is the issue of cooperation. You mentioned the importance of cooperation and increasingly complex international campaigns in identifying operations, dismantling operations. But just as we are bringing together our closest allies to achieve that goal, so does Russia. It has developed intelligence relationships with China, with Iran, with a number of other entities and countries. And some of these operations are now run jointly, both cyber operations and human operations. what do we need to know about these dynamics, and how does this change the operational methods of Russia?
Well, I think we hear a lot about Russia's interaction with China in particular over the past few years, particularly since the Russian invasion of Ukraine. In many aspects, that relationship appears to be real, particularly in the diplomatic and the economic realms. And even to some extent, some cooperative military exercises as well. I would say in the intelligence realm, though, there's still competition there. The Russian Federal Security Service, FSB in particular, doesn't seem to have signed on to that relationship fully. Between 1999 and 2017, at least 23 Russians were prosecuted in Russia for espionage on behalf of China. Most of those cases involved military-related technology, particularly aviation and space technology. There are also 2 FSB officers arrested in 2017 for providing internal FSB information to the Chinese Ministry of State Security. In addition to that, Chinese hackers have targeted a variety of Russian computer systems, including government agencies, military officials, S&T development companies. Among the victims is the large Russian military R&D company, Rostec, from which hackers are suspected of stealing Russian radar and electronic warfare capabilities. Chinese hackers, I misspoke. In addition to that, the FSB also has some of the highest concentration of border guard positions on the Chinese border. So it rivals the North Caucasus for having the most border guards. The Russian Far East directorates, like in the Amur Oblast and the Jewish Autonomous Oblast and Zabaikalsky and Primorsky Krais, are some of the most robust in Russia. Further, in the early 2000s, FSB officers were investigated in several cases involving smuggling commercial goods from China into Russia. And one of those cases was called the Chinese contraband case. So the FSB doesn't hesitate to publicize and call out China for operations against Russia. So while there's been a lot of talk of that Russian-Chinese relationship, and it's not just superficial talk. There's some reality behind it. In the intelligence realm, they're probably not as close as they are in the diplomatic realm. Now, as far as Iran's concerned, I actually don't have as much data on Iran, but Russia and Iran have also had some rough patches in the past. When it comes to Iran openly supporting Russia, Iran's hesitant to do that. So even Iran is tentative when it comes to intelligence relationships.
Now, this is very interesting, first of all, because it should be exploited more often, but I'm not entirely sure to what extent our capabilities are currently sophisticated enough to engage in very affirmative confrontations and penetrations of that sort, though they should be. But in terms of China-Russia dynamic, there's been a lot of talk about how China is the greatest beneficiary of the war in Ukraine, which weakened Russia's military, caused Russia to become more economically dependent on China, devolved its capabilities in various parts of the world, and in other words, basically put China in a more forward position. But what you're telling me is that there is still a scientific and technological disparity, which seems to be working one way. It's China that's trying to penetrate Russia's technological sector and steal information. It means China is still far behind these developments, and to say nothing of the United States, it's very good at stealing information. It's very good at using it to ramp up its capabilities, but is there real innovation? Quite clearly, if it's dependent so much on both US and Russia, no, it's not. And the fact that you're telling me that there's been so much penetration into Russia and so much attempted theft, it seems China is not quite as sophisticated a threat as it's being made out to be by some of the actors. It's a threat to be reckoned with, but it certainly has its vulnerabilities. And the fact that this is a one-way dynamic, maybe Russia is not quite as dependent on China in certain realms as people, as again, even during the war, even with all the sanctions. What can you tell us about this relationship, which I think is extremely important to understand, in part because there's so much disinformation and misinformation, misunderstanding about it.
One of Russia's worst nightmares would to become China's little brother, become dependent upon China. And that is a factor that inhibits a complete alliance between Russia and China. Russia realizes that economically, China is much stronger than Russia, and than Russia will ever be.
Mm-hmm.
Technologically, China is moving very quickly. And they're moving that so fast, partially because of the information they're able to acquire from other countries. But China has been pouring billions of dollars equivalent into technological advancements. So they are not to the point where they can develop everything their own, all of the technological innovations on their own that they need, but they're getting closer to that all the time. And so China is a concern, long-term concern, because of that. But that's a concern to Russia too, though. And Russia knows that. Russia doesn't want to become subordinate to China. In Central Asia, Russia is already on the edge of becoming subordinate, where the Central Asian states rely on China to a great extent for their economic well-being. And they can't look to Russia for that. Even countries like Armenia are reconsidering their relationship with Russia because there are stronger powers out there, China being among them. The ability of China to pour billions of dollars into infrastructure projects is attractive to a lot of countries in the world. And that is a concern for Russia. It's not to say that Russia's lost all influence. You can't go that far. But Russia sees a long-term growth of Chinese influence as a threat, just as the United States does.
Meanwhile, while all of this is going on, Russia is still quite capable of running very sophisticated operations, and many of these media campaigns, scandals, reputational attacks, and character assassinations, and so forth, have been quite effective against industries, companies, countries, individuals, and a lot of it is not just based on the effective use of information space, but on more what people think of traditionally as intelligence operations, meaning, quite frankly, blackmail and leverage. To what extent has Russia been able to penetrate governments and still been able to use that sort of blackmail in the current environment where a lot of, past sex and financial scandals no longer have the same potency? Can these tools still be effective, and if so, why? And what can be done to guard against such operations? Because I have seen specific instances where very friendly democratic governments have actively enacted policies not in the direct interests of their own countries, and that presumably can only be due to some sort of a leveraged by somebody.
There are still countries with common interests with Russia.
Mhm.
And those common interests are things that Russia can grow from. Common interests diplomatically across the, for me, with the dime-fill spectrum, the diplomatic, informational, military, economic, financial, intelligence, law enforcement, that kind of, that those levers of national levers of security power, national power. Russia still has access to those levers, and it can use them, particularly in the information realm, but also in the diplomatic realm, by approaching countries and offering incentives to countries to support Russia diplomatically in the world. There have been 6 UN General Assembly votes since the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And for the most part, the countries that have voted in favor of condemning Russia are the countries in which Russia doesn't have as much influence. But there are some parts of the world where Russia still does have influence, particularly Africa, Southeast Asia. And it is in those countries where Russia is able to have more success in those security goals that I mentioned earlier, by portraying Russia as an indispensable player in the world, by counterweighing the unipolar actor. Any country in the world that is suspicious of US power is a country where Russia has an avenue for input. And there are countries in South Africa, Africa, Southeast Asia, for example, that still have a colonial memory and see European powers, the United States, as the source of their problems. And Russia can exploit that. And there are countries in which Russia has a much stronger information dissemination system than European or North American countries have. And so if you ask a person on the street in some African countries, why is there a war in Ukraine? They will give a very Russian answer. And that's because that is the information that they hear. Russian information dissemination has been very strong in those countries. And it hasn't been countered as well by other narratives coming from Europe or the United States. Russia is also, in the economic realm, has been developing trade ties with countries that have a desire to circumvent US and European sanctions. And those countries, particularly oil-producing countries, have been willing to strengthen their ties with Russia because they lose out to a certain extent in those sanctions. And if Russia can say, we can help you maintain your exports if you join with us in the diplomatic world, or if you provide weapons to us, then there are countries that are very willing to do that. So Russia is not devoid of all influence because it has those ins in countries that are willing to support it.
Not only that, but Russia has actually been growing its influence in spheres that were previously dominated by the United States and UK and Western countries, specifically a lot of the Middle East, big chunks of the Middle East, GCC in particular. The concern here is, of course, not only just the strengthening of trade ties and economic, sanctions, but the fact that Russia may be willing to outsource some of its intelligence methods for the operational value of these countries, to assist them on particular operations, to strengthen intelligence ties, and to generally disrupt their intelligence corporations on counterterrorism, on other issues with the United States, with the European countries, and so forth. How do we avoid that? How do we prevent it from happening? Because I just do not see US, which has been basically mostly focused on peace deals with Iran and this and that climate change. I don't see this traditional kind of orientation, this traditional realm being protected from foreign influence, from Russian Chinese influence. How do these sensitive relationships are in danger of being compromised? And we have seen some of the Russian playbook from non-Russian states, from U.S. allies, play out in U.S. soil, in courts, in the media, in various other operations. So how do, and at some point it can actually make us a target as well. What do we do?
Certainly. There's a clandestine battle going on between intelligence services, between the influence that one intelligence service has over a country and another intelligence service has over that same country. The powers of the world are conducting a tug of war against some countries, and Russia has succeeded in that tug of war in some countries. And part of the incentive to doing that is to provide them with intelligence training, with intelligence methodologies, with intelligence technology. That if country X might say, if we're going to help you, then you've got to give us something in return. And those intelligence-related transactional paybacks are in the mix. But every country's doing that. And the fact that we're not seeing that doesn't mean it's not happening. That there are clandestine and non-public relationships all over the world that a country is not, it has no incentive to make public. Because if the world knows that country X is cooperating with the United States, that might make country X look bad. Or to the converse, if that country is directly cooperating with Russia, they don't want the world to know that either, because that country could then be the target of diplomatic condemnation by the West. So that clandestine tug of war is going on all the time. It has been in existence since the Cold War. The identities of countries that align on either side of that tug of war changes all the time. One country might take a better deal from Russia than they do from the West, but it's transactional, and it is relationship based, and it's just it is an ongoing battle.
In other words, U.S. has a very good chance at U.S. and its allies at prevailing if they focus on building substantive relationships quietly and not destroy them through politics and so forth. That's something to be hopeful about, but at the same time, we are seeing very public fruits of success by Russia and China, such as the strengthening of non-aligned and Russia and China-led organizations, BRICS, and the de-dollarization campaign, and of course the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, and the interest for at least an observer status by formerly strongly U.S. allied or neutral countries. What can we offer them? What kind of alliances and groupings can we offer them to as counterweight to this hedging? And second, are these organizations penetrable? Can we disrupt their anti-American activities in some way?
What can we offer them? For every country, that's going to be different. Every country has its goals, its objectives, and we have to learn those goals and objectives well enough that we can appeal to them in some way. I can't speak to specific countries or to specific examples, but how can we prevent that from happening? We have to offer them something of value, just as Russia is doing. It is not that they're not swaying that direction out of the goodness of their heart. they're swaying that direction because they're getting some offer. It is the BRICS, for example. Why are the BRICS speaking positively about Russia? It's not because they think Russia is a great player in the world. It's because they're getting something. And so recognizing what they're getting and countering that is how we counterweigh that influence. And for every country, it's going to be different. And I'm sorry, I forgot the second half of your question.
Yes, I was. My second half was about penetrating these organizations, because while the focus on BRICS has been on this financial impact of overcoming disrupting, of weakening the US dollar and its financial influence on creating financial institutions, there is also a great likelihood that when this bloc starts to cooperate, intelligence and security relations also strengthen as a result, and they strengthen not only as a way of securities against organized crime or whatever, but also as an anti-American specifically, an anti-Western bent.
What better way to penetrate that organization than by having a US ally join it? So to some extent, those countries that have traditionally been Western in their focus, joining some of those, or at least observer status, the SCO, for example, as you mentioned, that can be to our advantage as well as our disadvantage if we play it right. We can use the traditional relationship that we have with a country to help us understand that block better, or to understand just what it is offering that we can then counter. So in the diplomatic world, those are to a great extent diplomatic and economic blocks. In the diplomatic and economic world, it's always what you have, what you can offer. And if we can have a voice inside that organization, that's even better for us.
I think that is something that our diplomats and officials should think about a little bit more in depth, because I see that the reactions have been a litany of concerned statements and not much action. I hope that will change as they get over they understand that this movement is not going in a span of less than a month from 5 or 10 BRICS aligned de-dollarization oriented countries. We've gone to over 40, and that's been less than a month of countries making those announcements. That doesn't mean that we are about to fail, that the dollar is about to collapse, but it does signal a particular.
At the same time as that's happening, I mentioned illegals earlier. Three of the illegals that have been Russian intelligence, in two cases SVR, in one case GRU, illegals that have been compromised over the past 8 or 10 months, were using Brazilian identity documents. What that tells me is that there is some cooperation between Brazil and the counterintelligence services in the countries where those illegals have been compromised. In one case it was Slovenia, in one case it was Norway. And there's some cooperation there. And the cooperation occurs at different levels in different spheres. And a country that is saying one thing publicly might be acting differently privately, but they don't want the world to know that how they're acting privately, because that then one might show them to be hypocritical, but also might weaken that private cooperation. So I don't know where all those alliances or the counterweights occur in the world. You'd have to ask somebody who's in the middle of that, and they probably wouldn't tell you. But there's a lot going on that we don't see. And I think for Russia, that volume of activity is probably moving away from their favor. I mentioned the UN General Assembly votes that have occurred to condemn Russia. There's one that occurred just a week and a half, end of April, that condemned Russia with some pretty strong language, and also included Georgia, going back to 2008, in the language of the condemnation. There were 12 new countries that voted in favor of that UN General Assembly resolution in April that had never voted in favor of any of the previous UN General Assembly resolutions. China being one of them, which was a surprise to the world when China actually voted in favor of that resolution. But there were, in addition to China, 11 others, including countries like Kazakhstan and Armenia, which one would think would be Russian allies. And India also voted in favor of that condemnation. So there's a lot going on under the table that we don't see. There's a lot of arms being twisted. There's a lot of incentives being offered that we don't have any idea what's going on. And that one data point of that UN General Assembly vote, along with those various indicators of cooperation that have been visible in the past year or so, give me some indication that Russia is hurting in that under the table war.
Well, that's a very positive, very positive thought. And to end and to wrap this up, I want to ask you for a bit of a prediction. We are living in an era of hybrid warfare, where new realms for integrating different capabilities emerge both for ourselves and our adversaries. Where do you see the Russian intelligence going? What new fields, what new directions, if any, do you see them moving in response to all these developments? Should be watching.
I never use the phrase hybrid warfare myself, because I don't think it means much. Basically, what hybrid warfare means is using all tools available: covert, overt, military, non-military, all in concert with each other to affect the international environment in the actor's favor. There's nothing new about that. There's nothing unusual about that. States always do that. Not just Russia, but all states do that. There's nothing hybrid about it. It's simply using all your tools. And what does the future look like? That Russia will take advantage of every benefit that it has across those tools: the diplomatic, informational, military, economic, the intelligence relationships, even law enforcement. Russia arrested the American journalist not long ago. That's a law enforcement action. So using all of those tools in concert with each other to sway the international environment in Russia's favor. That's what Russia is going to do. That's what Russia has been doing. That's what Russia did during the Soviet era. It is heavily using the diplomatic realm. As you've mentioned, it heavily uses the informational realm. It's using the military realm much more than it did previously, although there was still Russian military. Obviously, an overt military invasion of a neighboring country is bringing the military tool much more into the visibility than it was previously. But it's using the economic realm extensively as well. All of those, Russia will use every one of those to the fullest extent that it can. You mentioned those intelligence relationships, that will use that to the fullest extent that it can to prevent itself from collapsing. That's really where Russia stands today. Is it needs to avoid a loss of its influence in the world. and Russia is doing everything it can to prevent that. The weaknesses that have been manifested in Russia's military performance make it necessary for Russia to use those other levers even more, because it can't appear as threatening militarily as it previously has. And so in the diplomatic world, in the economic world, in the intelligence relationship world, it will use them even greater because it has to compensate for that performance in the military realm.
Well, thank you so much for these fascinating and thought-provoking insights, and I hope it kind of challenges our listeners a little bit to think about this very dynamic field in a way that's kind of a little bit less about the media talking points and more complex, more information based, and a little bit more interesting, in my opinion.
I hope so.
Thank you so much. And for those who've been watching the program, this, of course, was the Washington Outsider Report on the Coalition Radio, this time with Kevin and Riehle. And we've been discussing the Russian intelligence and its how it has evolved over the years, where it's now, and how some of the sophisticated operations we are seeing unfold in the media, and also behind the scenes. What are the drivers behind them? Please join us next week, same time, Tuesday, 9 p.m. And video was Irina Zuckerman, the editor-in-chief of the Washington Outsider. Thank you so much and have a good night.
Thank you.